to talk about Eric Nadel and the fact that I wanted to be you growing up. This was like just the radio announcer.
Sure.
I feel like I know you're doing a lot of TV now.
Well, we're doing the pre and the post game now on TV.
Yeah.
I've always resisted doing the play-by-play on TV.
Okay.
For a myriad of reasons. Always preferred staying on radio.
What are some of the reasons then?
Start with the fact you don't get to do postseason games on TV. You work all year, and then your team makes the playoffs, and every postseason game is a national broadcast. If you're the TV announcer, like Dave Raymond during our World Series run, you go home. You don't get to do them. On TV, you don't get to describe things. You're basically, what they say when you learn broadcasting play-by-play, they say on radio, you have to paint the word picture. On TV, you just put captions on the pictures. You're constantly being led by what's on the monitor and what some guy is telling you, talking in your ear, which I don't particularly like. For me, the real challenge, the real joy of doing radio play-by-play is the description, painting that word picture so that somebody can actually see in their imagination what's going on in the ballpark. And then it was kind of a deal breaker for me that on TV, you had to wear a coat and tie. They've done away with that, fortunately, but that was a deal breaker for me. I'm not wearing a coat and tie to a baseball game, especially at our previous ballpark where it was always 90 degrees in the booth. We had air conditioning, but as soon as we opened the windows, it wasn't air conditioned anymore. And I also thought the whole concept of wearing a jacket and tie to a baseball game for announcers to me was ridiculous. You're trying to sell the idea of fun at the ballpark. This isn't the 1940s where guys are showing up at the ballpark in jackets and ties and hats. Try and identify with your audience. And so now, as we should, we're wearing branded Ranger gear on TV. And that's what we should have been doing all along, and I think that's what everybody should be doing. Now, if it's a special occasion like opening day, we wear jackets and ties, but hopefully that'll be the only time we wear them this year.
That's the painting the picture, though. That's the thing. The description, the exact, that pitch, the evaluation of this umpire early in a game, and then you'll paint that picture as well. That's really what always drew me to it, was lying in bed, listening to baseball play-by-play. My dream was to become a Major League Baseball play-by-play announcer and do that for 40 years.
Yeah, and my dream too was to be a play-by-play announcer, but I grew up in New York City, in Brooklyn to be exact, listening to Marv Albert do the New York Knicks and the New York Rangers on the radio. And that's how I decided for sure that this is what I wanted to do. And people would ask me, and hockey was always my first love, and people would ask me, what are you going to do when you grow up? And I would say, well, I'm going to be like Marv. I'm going to be the voice of the Rangers. I wasn't specific enough.
Yeah. I was going to ask that because mine was Joe Tate and Nev Chandler. That's who I grew up with. Did you know those guys?
I met each of them a couple of times. Nev did some Indians ball back then. Right. And Joe one time just happened to be at a game, but I never knew him much.
Okay. But those were my influences.
And baseball, were you listening to Herb Scorer?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. No, Joe Tate was on the radio with Herb Scorer for quite a few years. So was Nev Chandler.
Yeah.
But Herb Scorer was the old color commentator, the former left-handed pitcher. I guess he could have still been a left-hander, but yeah. Anyway, that's just my radio meant so much to me, and so. Yeah, basically, it was Marv was your main guy.
Well, it started with baseball, with listening to the Yankees, Mel Allen and Red Barber. When I first found out those guys were getting paid, I was about 7 or 8 years old, and I asked my dad how they got off work to go to the game that afternoon, and he said, no, that's their work. My dad was a dentist. I said, so you're going to go back to the office and fill some cavities, and these guys go to Yankee Stadium.
You're like, wait, what?
And
really?
Blah, blah, blah. They get paid. Dad, they have a better job than you. I want to do that. But it wasn't really until I heard Marv that I became totally focused, totally enamored with the prospect of doing that.
So what was your journey? You said minor league hockey. What was your first job, and how'd you get to
I got into it basically through college radio. I went to Brown University, and I became the voice of the Brown University Bruins hockey team. And I sent out 1 million tapes when I got out to basically every minor league hockey team in the country. And when I graduated, I did not have a job. So I continued doing my college job, which was a janitor.
I read that, yeah.
Houses.
Goodwill Hunting.
What is this, like
situation.
mid-70s?
So this was 1972.
Okay.
So I'm cleaning toilets and, and cleaning hair out of shower drains.
Dave Raymond, he lived sort of in a college something. He had maybe a homeless situation in Stanford where he was like stealing pizza from a trash and living
on people's couches, couch surfing.
So you were cleaning a college.
I was actually getting paid enough to share a house with four other guys. But then I got a phone call from the owner of the Muskegon Mohawks in Muskegon, Michigan, and his announcer had just quit. And he went to the file, and they always say, "We'll keep your application on file." And you go, "Yeah, right." Well, he went to the file and he looked at it, and he was going through the file, and he actually saw that I had gone to Brown, and that's why he called me first, because Brown had a reputation as producing smart people, and he thought, well, this kid must be smart. I'll call him up, and we had a really long conversation, and he called me back the next day and offered me the job. And next thing you know, I was the voice of the Muskegon Mohawks in the International Hockey League for 3 years. It was the lowest level of professional sport. It was the equivalent to the movie Slapshot. It was just like that. Slapshot was about the Eastern League, which was the same level, basically AA hockey, which didn't go any lower than AA. And in fact, in that movie, the Hanson brothers in that movie tried out for our team. They were the Carlson brothers in real life. They tried out for our team, and they didn't make it. They didn't skate well enough. And the fighting was attractive, but they didn't skate well enough to make our team, and they wound up going to Johnstown or wherever it was and making a name for themselves in the movies.
I read that at your second hockey gig, you got the gig over Doc Emmerich.
Yeah, that was crazy. Yeah,
that'll keep you humble throughout your life.
Well, Doc was in Port Huron, Michigan, in the same league, and we were all trying to get out of there, trying to move up the ladder. And I applied for a job in Oklahoma City, and the general manager, who was also the coach and traveled with the team, of course, decided that he was going to interview the 2 finalists at dinner in Montreal during the hockey annual meetings in June. And he interviewed me the first night, and he started drinking before we even sat down. He's ordering Blonde Dubonnet and all these other things I'd never even heard of. And I just stayed with him drink for drink all night, and we were just hammered, completely hammered. And as I staggered back to my hotel room, I thought, I think that went pretty well. And then the next night, he was going to interview the other finalist, and he called me up at midnight, and he said, "Hey, Eric, I just want to tell you, you got the job." He says, "But I got this problem." And I said, "What's the problem?" He says, "I don't know how to tell this guy, Mike Emmerich, that I'm not hiring him." And Mike doesn't drink that much. And I thought to myself, I just got a job because I'm a better drinker than Mike Emmerich.
There are pros and cons.
And so now when, I go talk to the play-by-play class at North Texas, and they ask me, what should you do to, be a play-by-play announcer, I always say, and learn how to drink. It might help you someday.
Boy, that's changed over the years. It feels like that, because we hear stories about Galloway and just all those guys drinking in the press box, and that'd be such a big deal.
There was always beer in the press box. It was, it was just acknowledged that was the case.
Also in the clubhouse, right? Yeah,
sure.
Charlie Huff would be.
Yeah, beer and cigarettes, too.
Right.
Guys would be sitting around their lockers smoking cigarettes and drinking beers.
I bet you have some crazy minor league hockey war stories.
Absolutely. And it was one of these leagues where players were trying to establish themselves by fighting, and the crowds were crazy. And there wasn't plexiglass. There was chicken wire in most of the stadiums, most of the arenas. And fans would come with pins and would actually stick the players with pins through the chicken wire when they got checked up against the board where the wire was on, at the end of the rink. Things like that. And so players would wind up climbing up into the stands, throwing chairs, not to mention the brawls that you'd have on the ice where the entire teams would be involved. The benches would empty and, have these incredible Donniebrooks on the ice.
People complain about social media. It has a lot of negative impacts, but I feel like that happens less now because people know there's a camera everywhere.
Yeah, maybe so. Maybe so. I think it certainly has curbed the way professional athletes and other celebrities lead their social lives.
Sure. Yeah, that's true.
No
for
question, And I don't go to the same places on the road I'm sure that our players do now. I'm old enough to be their grandfather. But I never see a player at any of the bars I go to on the road. And maybe they're going out and they're just going to different types of places, but, never. And, the type of music that I go see is probably not the type of music that these, 25-year-old kids go see.
So had you done baseball before taking the...
No, I had not. The Rangers called me up. I was doing the Dallas Blackhawks, which is a job I got after the 1 year in Oklahoma City. And the Rangers called me and said they had a guy, Bill Merrill, who was going to retire in a year, and they wanted to kind of groom his successor. And they loved the way I did hockey, and they wanted to know if I had done baseball. So I lied, and I said that I had, but I didn't have a tape. So they let me record 4 games into a cassette recorder. I'm sitting in a box at the old stadium, the original Arlington Stadium. And based on that, they weren't sure whether to hire me or not. They were continuing to interview me and talk to people. And they had another job open selling advertising on the broadcasts. And they were trying to convince me to take that job instead. And I said, well, I tell you what, if you hire me for the broadcast job, I'll do the advertising job and you won't have to hire a second person. And meanwhile, they didn't have a whole lot of money then. I'm in town already. They don't have to pay moving expenses. I was already completely vetted from having been in the market for 2 years, and they went for it. So for the first 5 years I had the job, I also sold advertising in the off season.
Wow.